While much of medieval Europe lived simply, there was a city in Africa where scholars gathered to study philosophy, law, and science. Gold was so common in this land that its ruler was known for giving it freely to strangers. The wealth of this empire was so vast that when its emperor traveled beyond Africa, his spending disrupted economies across the Mediterranean for years. This is not a legend. This is the real history of Timbuktu and the Mali Empire. It was a civilization marked by learning, trade, and extraordinary prosperity. One that challenges modern assumptions about the medieval world. Yet its story is often misunderstood. The fall of this empire was not caused by sudden war or natural disaster, but by slower forces that worked quietly over time. Understanding those forces reveals a deeper and more complex history than most people are ever told. Long before Europe learned to measure wealth in cathedrals of stone and treasuries of coin, the Sahel carried a different arithmetic. Here, prosperity moved with caravans, with camels cutting slow lines through dust, with rivers that flooded and withdrew like breath. The land did not glitter. It endured. At its margins, where sand met savanna, a city took form not in marble or myth, but in function. Timbuktu rose without spectacle, anchored to geography, sustained by movement, and shaped by silence as much as by exchange. Its wealth was neither sudden nor ornamental. It accumulated patiently, measured in reach rather than display. To approach Timbuktu is to understand constraint before abundance. The heat narrows attention. Wind carries grit that settles into cloth and skin, erasing distinction between traveler and terrain. Nothing here invites excess. The Niger River bends southward nearby, a dark ribbon against pale ground, offering passage where roads cannot survive. Northward stretches the Sahara, not as emptiness but as corridor, crossed by generations who learned to read stars, winds, and endurance. Timbuktu emerged where these forces converged, not because rulers decreed it so, but because movement demanded pause. Trade requires rest. Knowledge requires gathering. The city answered both needs. Medieval wealth is often imagined as static, locked behind walls or altars, but in West Africa it remained fluid. Gold did not remain where it was pulled from the earth. Salt did not linger in the desert. Each traveled outward, passing through many hands, accruing value through distance and risk. Timbuktu did not mine gold or carve salt. Controlled access. Caravans arrived heavy with goods and fatigue, and left altered by exchange, carrying textiles, manuscripts, and ideas alongside metal. The city's prosperity lay in regulation and trust, in predictable systems enforced by custom and authority, rather than ostentatious display. Europe, at the same moment, was divided by forests and feudal obligation. Wealth clustered in courts and monasteries, guarded and inherited. Timbuktu's riches moved differently. They circulated through markets shaded by cloth and reed, through mosques built from mud and timber, through the hands of merchants who understood credit long before banks gave it architecture. Accounts were kept not only in coin but in reputation. A broken promise traveled faster than a caravan, and loss of trust was costlier than theft. Such systems demanded literacy, memory, and restraint. They rewarded stability over spectacle. The city's physical form reflected these priorities. Buildings were low, their walls thick against heat, their lines softened by sand. Streets bent around wells and courtyards, shaped by use rather than plan. Sound carried differently here. The call to prayer drifted across open space, unamplified, absorbed by earth. At night, the city dimmed quickly, light surrendered to stars. Nothing announced grandeur, yet everything signaled permanence. Timbuktu did not dominate its environment. It negotiated with it, adapting rhythm and architecture to conditions that punished arrogance and rewarded patience. Learning followed similar patterns. Knowledge arrived as travelers did, slowly and deliberately. Scholars crossed the desert alongside traders, bringing texts wrapped against dust, their pages already worn by prior journeys. Study took place not in isolated towers but within the city's daily life, where law, theology, astronomy, and commerce intersected. Education was not separated from survival. Understanding contracts, inheritance, and celestial movement had immediate consequence. The accumulation of manuscripts was not vanity. It was infrastructure, supporting administration, trade, and moral authority within a complex and diverse empire. To call Timbuktu legendary is to misunderstand its discipline. Legends exaggerate, systems persist. The city's reputation grew because it functioned reliably across generations. Wealth did not depend on a single ruler's whim or a single harvest's success. It rested on routes maintained, disputes mediated, and obligations enforced. When caravans altered their paths, Timbuktu adapted. When scholars disagreed, arguments were preserved rather than erased. This endurance contrasted sharply with European centers whose fortunes rose and fell with dynasties or wars. Timbuktu's strength lay in continuity, not conquest. Yet continuity did not imply isolation. The city was outward-facing by necessity. Arabic connected it to Cairo and Mecca. Gold connected it to Mediterranean markets. Ideas moved alongside goods, reshaping local practice without erasing it. Timbuktu absorbed influence selectively, translating rather than imitating. Its scholars wrote in Arabic while grounding their work in African realities. Its merchants negotiated with foreign buyers without surrendering control of supply. Wealth here did not require cultural submission. It required negotiation, memory, and a clear understanding of value beyond ornament. By the time European chroniclers began to hear of Timbuktu, the city was already old. Its systems had matured without their observation. Maps drawn from distant hearsay placed it inaccurately, imagining spires and palaces where there were libraries and markets. This misunderstanding persisted because it served expectation. Europe measured significance by visible monument. Timbuktu measured it by influence and reach. The difference was not merely aesthetic. It reflected divergent relationships to land, labor, and time, shaped by environment as much as belief. This story begins, then, not with a ruler or a spectacle but with recalibration. To understand Timbuktu is to adjust assumptions about where medieval power resided and how it expressed itself. Wealth did not always announce itself in stone. Sometimes it moved quietly, recorded in ink, preserved in custom, and sustained by geography. Timbuktu stood as evidence of that alternative order, a city whose prosperity was real, measured, and deeply rooted, long before European expansion reshaped the world's balance. Before Mali became an empire recognized beyond the desert, it existed as an alignment of necessities. Its power did not emerge from sudden conquest or singular ambition, but from long familiarity with land that demanded organization to survive. The Western Sahel offered abundance unevenly, scattering its riches beneath soil, within rivers, and across distances that punished disorder. Gold lay to the south in forested regions, heavy and inaccessible without cooperation. Salt rested far to the north, cut from desert beds where life itself was provisional. Between them stretched savanna and river, corridors that rewarded those who could regulate movement rather than dominate terrain. Control of gold was never absolute ownership. The metal was extracted by communities who understood its danger as much as its value. Gold destabilized as easily as it enriched. Too much circulation invited raiders, too little stalled exchange. The early rulers of Mali learned restraint through necessity. Gold was taxed, weighed, and released carefully, its flow slowed to maintain scarcity. What mattered was not extraction alone, but mediation. Authority grew from the ability to stand between resource and market, to enforce consistency where nature provided volatility. Salt followed a similar logic. In the desert, salt was survival before commerce. It preserved food, sustained animals, and extended human reach into arid zones. Caravans hauling salt southward moved deliberately, paced by wells whose locations were guarded knowledge. Mali's influence extended not by marching armies across the Sahara, but by securing agreements that protected these routes. Stability along the salt roads meant predictable arrival, predictable pricing, and trust that outweighed brute force. The empire's borders were less lines than gradients of obligation. The Niger River bound these systems together. It curved through the landscape like a spine, offering transport where roads dissolved under rain and heat. River towns became nodes of authority, their docks quieter than ports but no less consequential. Grain moved along its banks. People moved with seasons. Taxation followed rhythm rather than calendar, adapting to floods and droughts alike. Mali's administrators learned to read the river's cycles, adjusting demands to avoid collapse. Governance here required patience, not rigidity. Taxation itself was neither arbitrary nor excessive. Early Mali rulers understood that extraction without reciprocity invited resistance. Levies were collected in goods as often as coin, reflecting an economy grounded in use rather than abstraction. In exchange, protection was provided, disputes were mediated, and routes were secured. Markets thrived because traders believed agreements would be honored beyond a single transaction. This belief, maintained across generations, became Mali's most valuable asset. Trade regulation extended beyond tolls and taxes. Weights and measures were standardized. Market days were observed and enforced. Disputes between merchants were adjudicated by officials trained in custom and law, often drawing on Islamic legal principles adapted to local context. The aim was not innovation but predictability. A trader arriving from distant lands needed assurance that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to justify return. Mali provided that assurance through quiet administration rather than spectacle. Administrative stability relied on delegation. Authority radiated outward through appointed governors who collected revenue and maintained order, but were themselves monitored. Loyalty was cultivated through shared benefit rather than constant threat. Governors prospered when trade prospered, tying their interests to imperial continuity. This system reduced the need for constant military presence, conserving resources and limiting disruption. Power here functioned through balance, not constant assertion. Military force remained present but restrained. Soldiers protected routes and responded to rebellion, yet warfare was not the engine of expansion. Campaigns were costly, destabilizing trade and draining labor. Mali expanded instead by absorbing regions already tied to its economic orbit. Communities joined because participation promised security and access, not because defeat was inevitable. This form of growth required discipline, resisting the temptation to overextend through conquest alone. Islam provided administrative coherence without erasing local tradition. Literacy supported record-keeping, contracts, and correspondence across distance. Religious institutions offered moral legitimacy to authority, reinforcing obligations between ruler and subject. Yet conversion was gradual, layered atop existing belief systems rather than imposed. This flexibility prevented fracture, allowing diverse populations to coexist within a single economic framework. Unity emerged through function, not uniformity. Wealth accumulated quietly under these conditions. Gold passed through hands that never owned its source. Salt moved southward without ever settling. Taxes filled treasuries not to be displayed, but to be redistributed in maintenance of routes, courts, and officials. The empire's prosperity remained largely invisible to outsiders because it was not concentrated in monuments. It resided instead in reliability, in systems that outlasted individual reigns. By the time later rulers inherited this structure, Mali was already vast in practice if not reputation. Its authority stretched because its systems held. Trade moved. Disputes were resolved. Obligations were met. This continuity made extraordinary wealth possible long before it drew attention. The empire did not wait for a charismatic figure to define it. It was already functioning, already disciplined, already rich in the only sense that endured. When a new ruler eventually emerged to embody its power, he would do so atop foundations laid patiently by geography, regulation, and restraint. Mansa Musa did not arrive as disruption. His authority formed within structures already old by the time his name entered record, shaped by customs that valued continuity over spectacle. The Mali Empire had long practiced succession through established lines, reinforced by councils, courtly expectation, and precedent. Power passed not to the loudest claimant but to the figure most capable of sustaining balance. Musa's rise followed this logic. He inherited a machine that functioned before him, one that demanded stewardship rather than reinvention. His position was defined less by ambition than by obligation. The empire he assumed stretched across climates and cultures, bound together by agreements that required constant maintenance. Gold continued to move south from forest regions. Salt traveled north from desert beds. Taxes flowed inward along routes kept open by negotiation and force in careful proportion. Musa entered authority knowing that excess in any direction risked fracture. His role was to preserve circulation, not interrupt it with personal assertion. Court life reinforced this restraint. Ritual, protocol, and council structured daily governance. Decisions unfolded slowly, shaped by advisors who represented military, religious, and commercial interests. Musa listened because listening sustained order. He ruled in a system that punished impulse. A misjudged levy could collapse a market. An unguarded route could invite predation. Authority here was measured in consistency rather than command. Islam framed Musa's worldview without isolating him from inherited custom. His education reflected the empire's gradual integration into the Islamic world, emphasizing literacy, law, and ethical governance. Faith informed obligation. It did not excuse indulgence. Religious scholars at court reinforced restraint, reminding rulers that wealth was trust rather than possession. Musa absorbed this lesson early. His piety expressed itself not in public display but in administrative care, in respect for learned counsel and legal process. The scale of resources under his supervision was unprecedented. Mali's gold reserves exceeded those of any contemporary polity, yet remained largely abstract within daily governance. Musa did not see gold as ornament. It functioned as instrument, enabling diplomacy, trade stability, and internal cohesion. Mishandling it would have consequences beyond borders. Musa understood that the empire's wealth invited attention even when unadvertised. Managing invisibility became as important as managing abundance. The geopolitical environment surrounding Mali was neither empty nor passive. North Africa remained connected through trade and faith, sensitive to fluctuations in gold supply. Eastern polities monitored trans-Saharan movement. Internally, subordinate regions balanced loyalty against autonomy. Musa inherited an empire secure but not invulnerable. Stability depended on continuous adjustment, responding to drought, shifting routes, and generational change. Leadership demanded endurance rather than innovation. Psychologically, Musa's restraint reflected awareness of scale. The empire's vastness discouraged personal proximity to consequence. Decisions made at court rippled outward, affecting communities he would never see. This distance required abstraction, yet also humility. Musa relied on reports, emissaries, and precedent. Authority became an exercise in trust. To govern Mali was to accept incomplete knowledge and act regardless, guided by structure rather than certainty. Military power remained present but secondary. Musa inherited forces trained to protect routes and suppress rebellion, yet he understood their limits. Violence disrupted trade. Soldiers consumed resources without generating them. Military action remained a corrective tool, not a governing principle. Musa favored reinforcement of loyalty through economic benefit, ensuring that regions prospered by remaining within imperial orbit. His religious commitment deepened over time, shaped by exposure to scholars and texts circulating through Mali's intellectual networks. Faith offered moral architecture, framing rulership as accountability before God rather than dominance over subjects. This belief encouraged generosity within bounds, discouraging hoarding while avoiding reckless distribution. Musa's piety reinforced caution, aligning spiritual obligation with political necessity. The court mirrored this balance. Ceremonial displays existed but avoided excess. Authority was communicated through order, not opulence. Foreign envoys encountered a ruler surrounded by discipline rather than spectacle. This understated presentation masked the empire's true scale, preserving strategic ambiguity. Musa learned that visibility could destabilize. Silence preserved leverage. Succession tradition further constrained his behavior. Musa ruled knowing his actions would shape expectations for those who followed. A ruler who broke custom weakened legitimacy for successors. Continuity mattered. Musa governed with awareness of lineage, viewing his reign as chapter rather than culmination. This perspective limited personal indulgence, emphasizing institutional health over individual legacy. Economically, Musa prioritized predictability. Taxes remained regulated. Trade routes received consistent protection. Markets operated without dramatic intervention. These choices lacked drama but preserved confidence. Merchants planned long journeys knowing conditions would not shift arbitrarily. Scholars traveled knowing patronage remained steady. Stability became policy. Musa's identity formed within these accumulated pressures. He was not a conqueror reshaping history by will alone. He was custodian of a system refined over generations. His greatness, still unexpressed, lay in recognition of limits. Authority, in his understanding, meant sustaining balance across distance and difference. By the time Musa's name would travel beyond Mali, his character had already been shaped by these responsibilities. He carried wealth without flaunting it, power without excess, faith without fanaticism. The empire functioned because its ruler understood that endurance required restraint. What lay ahead would test this discipline, but its foundation was already set. The pilgrimage did not begin as a performance. It began as obligation, shaped by faith and precedent rather than calculation. For a ruler whose authority rested on continuity and restraint, the journey to Mecca carried spiritual necessity and political risk in equal measure. Distance alone imposed discipline. The road eastward stretched across desert, river, and foreign court, demanding preparation measured in months and resources weighed against absence. Governance would continue without the ruler's physical presence, testing the resilience of systems carefully maintained. Movement itself altered perception. Musa traveled not as an isolated pilgrim but as the head of a vast household, accompanied by officials, servants, guards, and animals burdened with supplies. Each step forward converted abstract wealth into physical presence. Gold, previously regulated and largely invisible within Mali's borders, became tangible through transport. Caravans passing through Sahelian towns marked the passage of power long before they reached foreign lands, leaving impressions shaped by scale rather than intent. As the procession entered North Africa, its effect intensified. Local economies accustomed to gradual circulation encountered sudden abundance. Musa's generosity followed ethical expectation, distributing alms as religious duty, yet the quantities exceeded regional equilibrium. Gold entered markets faster than custom could absorb it. Prices shifted. Debts recalculated. Stability bent under the weight of abundance. What was given freely carried unintended cost, revealing how fragile economic balance remained beyond Mali's controlled systems. In Cairo, the disruption became undeniable. Gold flooded the city, altering value through excess rather than scarcity. Merchants adjusted prices upward, responding to sudden availability. Currency devalued. Musa's intentions remained pious, yet consequence disregarded intent. The city absorbed the shock unevenly, some enriched temporarily, others burdened by inflation that lingered after the caravan passed. Wealth here revealed its volatility, capable of destabilizing even sophisticated markets. Foreign observers struggled to interpret what they witnessed. Africa, long imagined through distance and assumption, appeared suddenly immense. Chroniclers recorded figures without comprehension, translating unfamiliar scale into exaggeration and myth. Musa became symbol before he became subject, his wealth eclipsing the systems that produced it. Timbuktu, Mali, and the Sahel compressed into singular astonishment. Complexity flattened into spectacle through external gaze. This shift carried consequence beyond narrative. Visibility invited inquiry. Trade networks adjusted expectations. Political actors recalibrated interest. Mali's prior advantage lay in discretion, its wealth circulating without attracting sustained scrutiny. The pilgrimage disrupted that balance. Musa's journey announced resources that could not be easily hidden again. Knowledge, once diffuse, consolidated around name and rumor. The empire entered broader consciousness, losing a measure of insulation. The return journey could not undo what movement had set in motion. Even as Musa adjusted generosity, borrowing gold in Cairo to stabilize markets he had unsettled, the impression endured. Attempts at correction revealed responsibility but could not erase exposure. Mali's ruler had learned that power carried beyond borders behaves differently, subject to interpretation rather than control. Wealth, once visible, escaped governance. Internally, the pilgrimage altered perception of authority. Musa returned with enhanced religious prestige, affirmed by proximity to holy sites and scholars. This reinforced legitimacy at court and among subjects who valued Islamic connection. Yet it also raised expectation. A ruler known for abundance faced increased demand. Generosity risked becoming obligation rather than virtue. Balancing faith-driven giving with fiscal discipline required renewed restraint. Psychologically, the journey sharpened Musa's awareness of scale. Abroad, he represented not only himself but an entire region misunderstood and newly scrutinized. Each interaction carried representational weight. Silence became statement. Gesture became message. Musa learned that absence of explanation allowed others to define meaning. Control over narrative diminished with distance, replaced by interpretation shaped by foreign priorities. The pilgrimage also altered Mali's position within Islamic networks. Scholars, artisans, and traders took interest, drawn by patronage and reputation. This influx promised enrichment but also introduced new dependencies. External knowledge arrived alongside external expectation. Mali's intellectual and economic autonomy faced subtle pressure as connections multiplied. Integration carried benefit and risk in equal measure. Militarily, nothing changed immediately. Borders held. Routes remained secure. Yet strategic calculation shifted. Knowledge of Mali's wealth adjusted the ambitions of distant actors. Future incursions would not arise solely from local dispute but from long-range desire. The pilgrimage planted awareness that would mature slowly, shaping centuries rather than years. Musa did not dramatize these consequences. His response remained administrative rather than performative. Records adjusted. Taxes recalibrated. Diplomatic correspondence increased. The empire absorbed visibility without immediate rupture, yet could not return to obscurity. The pilgrimage marked transition from regional power to global awareness, not through conquest but exposure. Prestige accumulated alongside vulnerability. Faith strengthened authority while attention strained insulation. The journey fulfilled religious duty while complicating governance. Musa returned to Mali carrying knowledge heavier than gold. Understanding that power revealed invites pressure, and generosity magnified can destabilize systems built on restraint. This was the cost of visibility. What had once functioned quietly now operated under watch. Mali's wealth remained intact, but its context changed. The empire moved forward bearing consequence rather than spectacle, entering a phase where reputation itself became an element requiring management. Timbuktu did not announce itself through skyline or spectacle. Its authority accumulated quietly, embedded in routine, shaped by repetition rather than ceremony. The city functioned as a hinge between worlds, its streets carrying the residue of movement long after caravans departed. Wealth entered not to be displayed, but to be absorbed, redistributed, and translated into forms that endured beyond trade cycles. Gold passed through markets quickly, but institutions remained, anchoring the city's influence more securely than any single fortune could. Urban life followed rhythms imposed by environment. Heat narrowed activity to morning and evening. Midday silenced streets, driving people into shade where conversation and study continued quietly. Buildings grew from earth, their walls thick, their forms adaptable, repaired rather than replaced. Nothing here aspired to permanence through monument alone. Durability came from use. Timbuktu's architecture reflected a city designed to serve function before symbolism, where learning and commerce shared space without rigid separation. Mosques stood at the center of this system, not merely as sites of prayer but as social infrastructure. They anchored neighborhoods, structured time, and hosted instruction alongside worship. Their courtyards gathered scholars and students who debated law, theology, and astronomy within earshot of markets. Knowledge circulated freely, shaped by proximity to daily life rather than isolation. Study here was practical, oriented toward governance, trade, and moral order as much as abstract understanding. Universities in Timbuktu lacked walls that distinguished them from the city itself. Education unfolded through mentorship, reputation, and lineage of scholarship. Teachers attracted students by rigor rather than title. Manuscripts passed hand to hand, copied slowly by scribes whose labor demanded patience and precision. Ink stained fingers as surely as dust, binding intellectual work to physical strain. Libraries grew not through conquest but accumulation, each text a record of connection linking Timbuktu to Cairo, Fez, and beyond. Scribes occupied a position of quiet authority. Their work preserved contracts, rulings, genealogies, and correspondence that sustained imperial coherence. Accuracy mattered. A miscopied clause could alter inheritance. An omitted word could provoke dispute. The discipline required cultivated restraint, reinforcing a culture that valued precision over flourish. Writing here was governance by other means, transforming spoken agreement into enduring obligation. Traders supported this intellectual ecosystem as reliably as patrons. Their wealth funded study not through excess, but through consistent support. Endowments sustained teachers and students, insulating scholarship from market volatility. This arrangement reflected mutual dependence. Scholars legitimized trade through legal clarity and ethical guidance. Merchants, in turn, ensured learning remained materially possible. Prosperity flowed through cooperation rather than hierarchy. The courts of scholarship operated alongside imperial administration, advising on matters where law and custom intersected. Judges trained in Islamic jurisprudence adapted doctrine to local condition, balancing text with precedent. Their rulings reinforced stability by aligning moral authority with practical necessity. Timbuktu's reputation grew from this alignment. Outsiders trusted its judgments because they emerged from lived context rather than abstraction. Intellectual life extended beyond religious study. Astronomy guided navigation and calendar. Mathematics supported accounting and taxation. Geography informed trade routes and diplomatic correspondence. Knowledge served survival as much as contemplation. This practicality attracted scholars from distant regions, drawn by an environment where learning carried immediate consequence. Timbuktu became destination not through coercion, but relevance. Wealth underwrote this system indirectly. Gold funded patronage but did not dominate it. Excessive display threatened balance, drawing envy and destabilizing trust. Timbuktu's elite understood restraint as strategy. Prosperity remained visible enough to sustain institutions, yet muted enough to avoid provocation. The city's strength lay in this calibrated presence, maintaining influence without inviting undue attention. The population reflected diversity shaped by trade. Languages overlapped. Customs intermingled. Differences required negotiation rather than enforcement. Urban cohesion depended on shared participation in markets, mosques, and courts. Identity here was layered, defined by role as much as origin. Scholar, trader, scribe, artisan, all contributed to the city's function. Timbuktu thrived because its systems absorbed difference without dissolving order. Education shaped leadership indirectly. Administrators trained in law and literacy governed more predictably. Officials understood precedent, reducing arbitrary decision-making. This consistency reinforced trust across distance, enabling the empire to function without constant intervention. Timbuktu supplied not only knowledge, but personnel capable of sustaining complex administration elsewhere. The city's prosperity thus rested on circulation of people and ideas as much as material wealth. Manuscripts traveled outward, shaping intellectual life across West Africa. Students returned to their regions carrying methods learned here, extending Timbuktu's influence without formal authority. This diffusion preserved relevance even as political conditions shifted. Silence played its role. Study demanded it. Night brought cooler air and focused minds. Lamps glowed softly in courtyards as pages turned and voices lowered. The city breathed differently after dark, its intellectual labor continuing quietly while markets rested. This endurance distinguished Timbuktu from cities dependent solely on commerce. Learning persisted independent of immediate profit. By converting wealth into institutions, Timbuktu insulated itself from fluctuation. Gold could be lost. Routes could shift. Knowledge, once embedded, endured. The city's identity stabilized around this conversion, redefining prosperity as capacity to sustain thought across generations. Timbuktu became capital not through decree, but through accumulation of trust in its institutions. This system required maintenance. Manuscripts decayed, teachers aged, students arrived uncertain. Yet the city adapted, renewing itself through continuity rather than reinvention. Timbuktu's intellectual capital rested on patience, discipline, and cooperation, binding material wealth to human labor and memory. Its influence expanded quietly, preparing it to endure pressures that lay ahead. Scale, once achieved, imposed its own demands. The Mali Empire now extended across distances that challenged memory as much as logistics, linking forest, savanna, and desert under a single authority that could not be physically present everywhere at once. Systems designed for coherence began to strain under their own reach. What had once been an advantage, breadth of resources and routes, now required constant calibration to prevent imbalance from becoming fracture. Trade, the empire's lifeblood, grew increasingly interdependent. Gold fields in the south relied on secure passage northward. Salt from the desert depended on stable southern markets. Disruption in one region reverberated across the whole. A drought altered grain supply. A contested well delayed caravans. Small failures accumulated quietly, stressing routes long assumed reliable. Administrators responded with adjustments rather than overhaul, yet each correction consumed attention and authority. Central control faced the challenge of distance. Messages traveled slowly, carried by couriers who crossed terrain shaped by season and risk. Decisions arrived after conditions had already shifted. Governors exercised discretion out of necessity, interpreting imperial policy through local context. This autonomy preserved functionality but diluted uniformity. Authority became uneven, its presence strongest near the center and increasingly interpretive toward the edges. Succession introduced further uncertainty. Mali's stability relied on accepted lines of inheritance, yet each transition reopened questions of legitimacy. Councils weighed precedent against circumstance, balancing continuity with capability. The process discouraged impulsive claimants but could not eliminate rivalry. Ambition waited patiently, surfacing during moments of transition. The empire's size magnified these tensions, as distant regions assessed new leadership through delayed information and rumor. Military resources, though substantial, faced limitations. Forces stationed to protect trade routes could not respond instantly to unrest across vast territory. Concentration of troops weakened some areas while strengthening others. Commanders exercised judgment shaped by experience rather than constant instruction. This flexibility preserved order but risked inconsistency. Loyalty depended increasingly on local benefit rather than imperial presence. Timbuktu remained luminous within this strain, its markets active, its schools populated, its libraries expanding. Yet its brilliance highlighted disparity. Prosperity clustered unevenly, sustained by routes that bypassed less connected regions. Peripheral communities felt marginalization not through oppression, but through exclusion from flows that favored established hubs. Grievance emerged quietly, expressed through withdrawal rather than revolt. Trade routes themselves began to shift. Environmental change altered paths once reliable. New competitors sought alternative corridors to avoid tolls and oversight. Commerce adapted pragmatically, following efficiency rather than loyalty. Mali responded by reinforcing some routes while conceding others. Control became selective, prioritizing corridors that sustained the imperial core. This recalibration preserved function but narrowed reach. The psychological burden of governance increased. Rulers and administrators confronted complexity that resisted resolution. Each choice carried unintended consequence elsewhere. Stability became less about growth and more about preservation. Decisions favored containment over expansion, reflecting awareness of limits. Empire, once an expression of possibility, now demanded endurance. Economic dependency deepened vulnerability. Regions specialized, producing surplus for trade rather than subsistence. This specialization increased efficiency but reduced resilience. Disruption exposed fragility, compelling central authority to intervene more frequently. Aid stabilized regions temporarily but drained reserves. Wealth circulated faster, consumed by maintenance rather than accumulation. Cultural integration faced parallel challenges. Diversity that once enriched the empire required ongoing negotiation. Islamic law coexisted with local custom, but boundaries blurred under stress. Disputes multiplied where authority overlapped. Courts resolved cases individually, yet pattern replaced clarity. Uniformity receded, replaced by patchwork governance adapted to circumstance. Communication limitations shaped perception. News of success traveled slower than rumor of failure. Isolated incidents appeared systemic to distant observers. Confidence eroded subtly, not through collapse but through doubt. Merchants adjusted risk calculations. Scholars reconsidered patronage. Loyalty persisted, but with greater caution. Timbuktu's intellectual life continued, yet scholars sensed tension beneath routine. Debates addressed not only theology but governance, ethics of authority, and responsibility under strain. Manuscripts reflected concern with order and justice, revealing awareness that systems required moral reinforcement to endure pressure. Learning responded to reality, not abstraction. Administrative refinement followed. Records grew more detailed. Oversight increased. Inspection replaced assumption. These measures strengthened control but slowed response. Governance became heavier, trading agility for assurance. The empire adapted without reversing course, accepting reduced momentum as cost of stability. Mansa Musa's successors inherited this complexity. The empire they governed remained vast and wealthy, yet more fragile than its outward appearance suggested. Strength resided in institutions strained but intact, requiring constant attention. Expansion ceased to be priority. Survival demanded discipline. The brilliance of Timbuktu now contrasted with periphery not as beacon but as anchor, tying resources and attention inward. Centralization preserved core stability while edges softened. The empire endured through compromise, conceding ambition to maintain coherence. This phase did not announce decline. It revealed limits. Mali continued to function, its systems absorbing stress without immediate rupture. Yet the effort required to sustain balance increased steadily. Distance, dependency, and succession layered pressure onto structures built for endurance, not infinite growth. What followed would not arise from single failure or moment of collapse. It would emerge gradually from these accumulated strains, as systems adjusted repeatedly until adjustment itself reshaped the empire. Mali remained powerful, but its equilibrium now required vigilance rather than confidence, signaling transition rather than end. Change did not arrive with the sound of conquest or the spectacle of sudden defeat. It settled slowly, almost imperceptibly, into the routines that had once sustained Mali's authority. The empire continued to function. Markets remained active, scholars taught, caravans crossed familiar ground. Yet the balance that held these elements together began to loosen. What had required vigilance now required constant negotiation, and even that proved insufficient to restore earlier certainty. Power did not vanish. It thinned. External pressures gathered without coordination, shaped by forces beyond Mali's immediate control. Trade routes that once converged predictably began to diverge as merchants sought efficiency over allegiance. New centers emerged along alternative corridors, offering access without imperial oversight. These shifts were pragmatic rather than hostile, driven by geography and profit rather than intent. Yet each diverted caravan reduced Mali's leverage, quietly narrowing its economic reach. Northward, political dynamics changed as well. States with growing military organization and administrative ambition recalibrated their interests toward the Sahel. Knowledge of Mali's wealth, once distant rumor, had become established fact. Attention followed, not always in the form of invasion, but through competition and negotiation that eroded exclusivity. Influence now had to be shared where it was once assumed. Internally, fragmentation followed similar patterns. Authority remained recognized, but unevenly applied. Governors in distant regions exercised discretion that increasingly resembled autonomy. Decisions once referred to the center were resolved locally, justified by necessity and delay. This decentralization preserved functionality in the short term while weakening coherence over time. Loyalty became conditional, tied to immediate benefit rather than inherited obligation. Succession compounded this gradual erosion. Each transition reopened questions that precedent could no longer fully answer. Candidates appealed to custom, capability, and support in varying measure. Councils deliberated longer, consensus harder to reach as the empire's diversity complicated agreement. No single dispute shattered stability, but the cumulative effect strained legitimacy, encouraging regions to hedge their commitments. Environmental conditions added further pressure. Variations in rainfall altered agricultural output, affecting taxation and provisioning. Communities adjusted by prioritizing survival over surplus, reducing contributions to imperial systems. Central authority responded with accommodation rather than enforcement, recognizing limits of extraction. These concessions preserved peace but reduced capacity, tightening constraints on governance. Military presence adapted accordingly. Forces redeployed defensively, focused on protecting remaining core routes rather than projecting authority outward. Campaigns became rare and cautious, aimed at containment rather than expansion. This restraint reflected realism rather than weakness, acknowledging that sustained coercion would exhaust resources already under strain. Order persisted, but ambition receded. Timbuktu felt these changes subtly. The city's intellectual life continued, yet the breadth of its influence contracted. Fewer scholars arrived from distant regions as patronage shifted and travel became less predictable. Manuscript production persisted, but circulation slowed. The city remained luminous, but its light reached less far. This contraction did not diminish achievement, but it marked a change in scale. Psychologically, the empire entered a period of adjustment. Confidence gave way to vigilance. Administrators planned conservatively, anticipating disruption rather than growth. Risk tolerance declined. Stability became an objective to be defended rather than assumed. This shift altered tone without dismantling structure, signaling transformation rather than collapse. Importantly, decline did not equate to failure. Mali's systems had been designed for endurance, not permanence. Their gradual adaptation reflected responsiveness to reality rather than inability to govern. What changed was context. Conditions that once favored centralized authority now rewarded flexibility and local initiative. The empire's earlier success had altered the environment in which it operated. Cultural life adapted alongside political structure. Local identities strengthened as imperial oversight loosened. Custom gained prominence where uniform law receded. This diversification preserved social cohesion even as centralized authority diminished. Mali's legacy endured through these localized expressions, embedded in practice rather than decree. External observers misinterpreted these changes. From afar, reduction in scale appeared as loss. Yet within, continuity persisted. Trade did not cease. It redistributed. Learning did not end. It localized. Authority did not vanish. It diffused. The empire transformed rather than collapsed, shedding breadth while retaining depth. This process unfolded across decades, not years. No single ruler presided over decline. Responsibility dispersed across generations responding to shifting conditions. To assign blame would be to misunderstand the nature of historical change. Mali's experience reflected limits inherent in scale, not errors of character. By the time competing powers asserted greater independence, Mali's grip had already loosened through adaptation rather than defeat. Regions adjusted without rebellion, recalibrating relationships to suit emerging realities. The empire remained present, but less directive, its authority one factor among many rather than overriding force. What endured was foundation. Institutions built during earlier stability continued to shape governance, trade, and culture even as imperial reach contracted. Timbuktu remained a center of learning. Routes continued to carry goods. Memory preserved coherence where power receded. This turning point passed without proclamation. It announced itself through altered routines, recalculated expectations, and quiet acceptance of limits. Mali did not fall. It changed. Its transformation illustrated that decline is not erasure, but transition shaped by forces no single ruler commands. The empire's story moved forward not toward sudden end, but toward reconfiguration, carrying its influence into forms less visible yet still enduring. Timbuktu's story settles not with ruin or silence, but with continuity absorbed into the wider fabric of history. The city does not demand reverence through spectacle, nor does it invite mourning for what was lost. Instead, it offers evidence, accumulated, layered, and enduring, that intellectual life can exist independent of empire and survive beyond the conditions that once elevated it. Its legacy is not an anomaly but a reminder of how knowledge has always moved. Quietly, collectively, and often against the assumptions of those who later record it. Historical narratives long privileged visibility over substance. Empires that left stone monuments or aggressive archives commanded attention, while societies whose achievements were dispersed across manuscripts, oral transmission, and local institutions were diminished or ignored. Timbuktu suffered this distortion. Its absence from dominant historical frameworks was not the result of insignificance, but of historiographical bias shaped by power, language, and access. What survived in the desert was less compatible with conquest-driven storytelling, and therefore easier to dismiss. Yet the evidence persisted. Manuscripts remained not as trophies but as tools. Legal opinions, astronomical calculations, poetry, and pedagogy endured through replication rather than preservation alone. Knowledge was not frozen in idealized form. It was used, argued over, corrected, and transmitted. This practical continuity stands in contrast to romantic portrayals that frame Timbuktu as a lost golden age rather than a functioning intellectual ecosystem sustained by effort and restraint. The minimization of African achievement did not occur by accident. It followed routes of trade, colonization, and scholarship that privileged certain centers while marginalizing others. Timbuktu's story challenges those hierarchies by revealing how medieval global history was never the possession of a single region. Ideas circulated across deserts and seas, shaped by scholars whose names rarely appear in modern curricula, but whose influence persists indirectly through systems of law, education, and theology. Understanding Timbuktu requires abandoning the expectation of spectacle. Its importance lies not in singular breakthroughs but in accumulation. Generations contributed incrementally, accepting limitations of environment and politics while maintaining standards of rigor. This discipline allowed learning to outlast prosperity. Where wealth fluctuated, knowledge adapted. Where power receded, memory compensated. The city's endurance depended on this balance. The shadow Timbuktu casts is therefore longer than its moment of prominence. Its influence diffused outward through students who carried methods rather than monuments. These individuals embedded practices elsewhere, making the city's legacy inseparable from broader intellectual traditions. Timbuktu did not need to remain dominant to remain relevant. Its impact survived precisely because it did not rely on control. Modern rediscovery often risks distortion. When Timbuktu is framed solely as symbol of wealth, mystery, or lost glory, it becomes detached from the labor that sustained it. Such portrayals obscure the everyday discipline that allowed scholars to work in heat, scarcity, and uncertainty. They replace process with myth. Correcting this requires restraint, acknowledging continuity rather than climax. The city's history matters because it destabilizes simplified narratives of medieval progress. It demonstrates that intellectual life flourished in multiple environments simultaneously, shaped by local conditions rather than centralized authority. Timbuktu was not peripheral to history. It was part of a shared human effort to understand law, faith, and the natural world. Its marginalization reflects later priorities, not medieval reality. There is no need to rescue Timbuktu through exaggeration. Its true significance withstands careful examination. The manuscripts speak with clarity, revealing scholars engaged with the same questions that occupied contemporaries elsewhere. The difference lies not in content but in recognition. Restoring Timbuktu to global history does not require elevation above others, only accurate placement alongside them. The resolution of this story is therefore quiet. Wealth faded as it always does. Trade routes shifted as they must. Political authority fragmented, as history repeatedly shows. Yet knowledge persisted, leaving traces that resist erasure. Timbuktu's endurance lies in this persistence, not in nostalgia for lost influence. To acknowledge this legacy is to accept a more complex past. It requires recognizing that historical value is not measured solely by expansion or domination. Intellectual contribution often survives in fragments, requiring patience to assemble. Timbuktu rewards that patience, offering coherence without spectacle. In this sense, the city stands as corrective rather than exception. It reminds us that history's center is not fixed, and that silence in the record often reflects omission rather than absence. Timbuktu was never lost. It was simply overlooked. As the narrative closes, nothing dramatic occurs. The city continues, altered but intact in memory and practice. Its manuscripts remain, its methods echo elsewhere, its story waiting not for rediscovery but for recognition. Wealth recedes into context. Knowledge remains, casting a longer shadow, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires.